The camera doesn't lie. Deep in the Alaskan mountains, one remote cabin, known only as AK-8, recorded something no one was supposed to see. A towering figure, broad-shouldered, breaking into the storage shed in the dead of night. At first, the worker stationed there thought it was just bears, or maybe shadows, but the trail cam images were real. Then came the silence. Whole forests going still, as if holding their breath. The reeking odor, like wet fur and musk, pouring through the walls, and the heavy footfalls that circled the cabin. Again and again. When the man tried to call for help, officials brushed it off as wildlife. But off record, even they admitted the evidence didn't add up. So what was it really? A predator staking its claim? Or proof of something intelligent, hidden in the Alaskan wilderness? You found your way here for a reason. In a world that can feel overwhelming, it's the gentle hearts that bring light. And yours is one of them. I'll never forget my first autumn in the Chugach Mountains. The year was 2008, and I'd taken a contract position maintaining a series of remote research cabins scattered through some of Alaska's most unforgiving terrain. My name is Daniel Harker, and before all this, I'd spent 5 years in wildlife management and forestry down in the lower 48. Nothing in my previous experience could have prepared me for what I encountered in those mountains. The Chugach Range is a sprawling wilderness of sharp peaks and hidden valleys, where weather can turn deadly within hours. That September, I arrived, just as the first hints of winter were creeping down from the higher elevations. The aspens had already turned golden, and there was a bite in the air that told me snow wasn't far behind. My supervisor, Dave Matthews from the Department of Natural Resources, met me at the ranger station in Palmer with a stack of paperwork and a set of topographical maps marked with the locations of the cabins I'd be responsible for. These structures need to stay operational through November, he explained, spreading the maps across his desk. Biologists and authorized hunters use them as research stations and emergency shelters. Your job is simple. Maintain the structures, check the wildlife cameras, and log any unusual activity. I remember nodding as I traced the route between the cabins. The furthest one, designated as AK-8, sat nearly 30 miles from the nearest road. Define unusual activity, I said, already mentally cataloguing the gear I'd need. Bear damage, mostly. Sometimes we get vandals, though that's rare this far out. Just document everything in detail. You've got a reputation for being thorough, Harker. That's why we picked you. He wasn't wrong about my attention to detail. In my previous positions, I'd developed a habit of keeping meticulous field notes. Every observation, measurement, and maintenance task went into my waterproof notebook with timestamps and GPS coordinates. Some of my colleagues used to joke about it, but that systematic approach had earned me this position. The next morning, I loaded my truck with supplies, tools for basic repairs, a small caliber rifle for bear protection, extra batteries for the trail cameras, and enough provisions to last several weeks. The forecast showed an early winter storm system moving in from the Gulf of Alaska, so I knew my window for reaching the more remote cabins might be limited. The drive to the first trailhead took 3 hours on progressively rougher roads. By the time I parked, the morning fog had lifted to reveal the massive scale of the landscape I'd be working in. The Chugach Mountains rose like a wall of stone and ice before me, their upper reaches already dusted with fresh snow. The air was thin and sharp with the scent of spruce and wet earth. I shouldered my pack and checked my GPS. The first cabin was a 4-mile hike, mostly following an old hunting trail that hadn't seen maintenance in years. As I walked, I began my first entry in my field notebook. September 15th, 2008. 0800 hours. Weather, overcast, 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Light wind from the northwest. Trail conditions, wet but passable. No fresh signs of large predators. The morning passed quietly as I made my way deeper into the mountains. Around noon, I reached the first cabin, a simple 12 by 16 foot structure with a metal roof and heavy shutters. The building was in decent shape, though the door needed some adjustment to seal properly against the coming cold. I spent 2 hours making repairs and checking the nearby trail camera, which had captured nothing more exciting than a few moose passing through. It was while reviewing the camera footage that I first noticed something odd about the ambient sound. The constant background noise of birds and small animals had suddenly ceased. In my experience, that usually meant a predator was moving through the area. I made a note of it, more out of habit than concern, and continued with my work. By late afternoon, I'd reached the second cabin and was already developing a routine. Check the structure's integrity, clean the solar panels, replace any damaged equipment, and review the trail camera footage. This location showed signs of bear activity, some scratches on the doorframe and scattered garbage from a broken bear-proof container. I logged everything, replaced the container, and made sure the cabin was secure before moving on. The third day of my circuit brought me to higher elevation, where the vegetation thinned and the wind carried the first real bite of winter. I'd been making good time, but the weather was deteriorating faster than forecast. Dark clouds were building over the peaks to the north, and the temperature was dropping steadily. I needed to reach AK-8, the most remote cabin, before the storm hit. The trail to AK-8 wasn't really a trail at all, just a series of GPS waypoints through increasingly rough terrain. I picked my way carefully across talus slopes and through stands of twisted spruce. The silence up here was different from the valleys below, more complete somehow. Even my footsteps seemed muffled by the heavy air. At 4,000 feet, I encountered the first patches of fresh snow. The flakes were small and dry, dancing across the rocks in the strengthening wind. I paused to add another layer of clothing and check my position. AK-8 was still 3 miles ahead, but the visibility was starting to deteriorate. I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left. My notebook entry from that point reads, September 17th, 1600 hours. Elevation, 4,200 feet. Temperature, 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Falling. Wind, northwest at 15 to 20 miles per hour. Snow beginning. Visibility decreasing to 1 mile. No wildlife signs observed in past 2 hours. Looking back now, I should have noticed how unusual that last detail was. Even in harsh conditions, these mountains were never completely devoid of wildlife signs. But at the time, I was too focused on reaching the cabin before dark to give it much thought. I finally spotted AK-8 through the thickening snow just before sunset. The cabin sat on a small plateau beneath a cliff face, partially sheltered from the wind. As I approached, I conducted my usual exterior inspection. The structure appeared sound, though there was something odd about the pattern of wear on the logs that I couldn't quite place. I made a note to examine it more closely in better light. Inside, the cabin was basic but well maintained. A wood stove, 2 bunks, a small table, and storage for emergency supplies. I quickly got a fire going and began my standard checks. The trail camera mounted on a nearby tree had plenty of battery life, so I retrieved its memory card to review the footage. As I was setting up my laptop, the wind shifted, and for a moment, I caught an unfamiliar odor, something musky and organic that didn't match any of the usual wilderness smells I knew. It was gone before I could really analyze it, and the howling wind made it impossible to tell which direction it had come from. I added one final note before turning in for the night. Cabin AK-8 secure, all systems functional. Note, unusual wear, patterns on exterior logs, possible weather damage, unknown organic odor detected briefly at 1845 hours. We'll investigate further in daylight. Weather deteriorating rapidly. May need to shelter in place until storm passes. That first night in AK-8, as the storm raged outside and the fire burned low, I lay awake listening to the wind. Except sometimes, between the gusts, I could have sworn I heard something else. Something that sounded almost like wood knocking against wood, too rhythmic to be random. I told myself it was just branches in the wind, but I made sure my rifle was within reach before finally drifting off to sleep. I didn't know it then, but that first day in the Chugach Mountains was the beginning of something I'm still trying to understand. The strange sounds and smells, the unusual silence, the wear patterns on the cabin. They were all signs, if I'd known how to read them. but I was still thinking like a wildlife technician, trying to fit everything into neat, scientific categories. The mountains would soon teach me that some things don't fit into any category we know. September 16th, 2008, Day 2, at AK8. The morning brought 6 inches of fresh snow and temperatures hovering around 32 degrees Fahrenheit. I started my day by checking the trail cameras, brushing off the accumulated snow and verifying their battery levels. All 4 units were functioning properly, their infrared sensors still properly aligned to capture any movement in their designated zones. Back at the cabin, I began the systematic maintenance checks that would occupy most of my day. The shutters needed attention first. The hinges on the west-facing window had developed a worrying amount of rust. I spent an hour carefully removing the oxidation and applying fresh lubricant, making sure each shutter could open and close smoothly. In my logbook, I noted: replace 2 loose hinge screws on west window shutters. Recommend full replacement next season. The supply inventory took longer than expected. Previous occupants had been careless about recording what they'd used, so I had to do a complete count. The emergency food cache was adequate, but would need rotating before spring. I marked several expired items for removal. The first aid kit required restocking, particularly the bandages and antibiotic ointment. These details matter when you're 20 miles from the nearest road. Around noon, I spotted fresh bear signs while gathering firewood near the creek. 3 distinct piles of scat, probably from a black bear, no more than 2 days old. The bear had been feeding heavily on late-season berries, which meant it was still building up fat reserves for winter. I marked the location on my map and made detailed notes about the scat composition and size. This was exactly the kind of wildlife activity the biology team wanted documented. The afternoon brought heavy cloud cover and a steady wind from the north. As I worked on the cabin's rain gutters, clearing them of debris and adjusting their pitch, I couldn't help but feel the growing sense of isolation. The nearest occupied structure was the ranger station at Miller Creek, and that was seasonal, likely already closed for the year. The satellite phone was my only reliable link to the outside world, and even that depended on clear skies. My journal entry from 3 p.m. reads: weather deteriorating, visibility down to approximately 1/4 mile, completed gutter maintenance and roof inspection. No structural issues noted. Bear activity observed near creek. Recommend updating warning signs at trail junction. The rest of the afternoon was spent organizing the tool shed and updating the maintenance log. Every tool had to be accounted for, cleaned, and properly stored. A missing hammer might not seem critical in civilization, but up here, having the right tool could make the difference between comfort and crisis. I checked the trail cameras again before dusk. The memory cards showed multiple recordings from the previous night, mostly triggered by snow falling or branches moving in the wind. One camera had captured a snowshoe hare moving through its frame, and another showed a brief glimpse of what might have been a pine marten. The evening brought more snow and dropping temperatures. I spent an hour splitting additional firewood, making sure to stack it properly on the covered porch. The woodpile needed to be precisely arranged. Loose stacking could lead to collapse under heavy snow, potentially blocking the door. In the growing darkness, I could hear the wind moving through the valley below, creating odd harmonics as it passed through the trees. The sound reminded me of why I'd chosen this work. There's a purity to these remote places, a sense of being completely present in the moment. But with that purity comes responsibility. Every decision, every maintenance task, every note in the logbook could affect the next person to use this cabin. My final task for the day was checking the solar battery bank and emergency radio. The batteries showed 78% charge, acceptable given the cloudy conditions, but I'd need to monitor them closely if the weather didn't improve. The radio crackled with static when I tested it, but I managed to catch part of the evening weather report. More snow expected overnight. The day's final journal entry. September 16th, 2008. All scheduled maintenance tasks completed. Solar system functioning within parameters. Bear activity noted and logged. New camera systems operational. Weather continues. to deteriorate. We'll reassess trail conditions tomorrow morning. As I prepared for another night in the cabin, I found myself double-checking the latches on the windows and door. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a heightened awareness of my solitude. Up here, 20 miles from the nearest road, with early winter closing in, there's no room for carelessness. The wood stove provided steady heat as I reviewed my notes from the day. Everything was documented in precise professional language: temperatures, maintenance tasks, wildlife signs. But between the lines of data and observations, I could feel something else taking shape. A growing awareness of just how alone I was in this vast landscape. I pulled out the topographic map and studied the surrounding terrain. The cabin sat in a relatively exposed position, with clear sightlines in most directions. Good for wildlife observation, less comfortable when the weather turns. The nearest high ground was a ridge about half a mile to the north, rising another 1,000 feet above the cabin's elevation. Below us, the valley dropped away to the east, eventually connecting with the main drainage that led back to civilization. The snow continued to fall as I made these notes, adding another layer of isolation to an already remote location. Each flake that struck the window seemed to whisper, "You are here alone, in a place where nature still holds all the cards." The isolation really started to sink in on my third day at AK8. I'd planned a hike to check some of the more distant game trails, following the river's course about 2 miles upstream. The morning was crisp. My thermometer read 38 degrees Fahrenheit at 700 hours, but the sky was clear enough that I only needed my light jacket. I kept detailed notes as I walked, documenting fresh bear tracks near the water's edge and marking potential spots for future camera placement. The river's constant rush provided familiar background noise, mixing with the chittering of squirrels and the occasional call of ravens overhead. Normal sounds, comfortable sounds, the kind you expect in the Alaskan wilderness. It happened around 10:30 in the morning. I'd stopped to photograph some unusual scratch marks on a spruce trunk, probably bear, but the spacing seemed off when I noticed the change. At first, I couldn't identify what was different. Then it hit me. The ambient noise had dropped away, like someone had slowly turned down the volume on the forest. Even the river seemed muffled. Though I stood no more than 30 yards from its bank, the squirrels had gone quiet. No birds called. The wind still moved through the trees, but somehow the rustling seemed distant, as if heard through thick glass. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know that sudden silence usually means a predator is moving through the area. Bears, wolves, they can trigger this kind of response. But this felt different. The silence was too complete, too thick, if that makes sense. I stood perfectly still for what my watch showed was 6 minutes, though it felt much longer. My hand had instinctively moved to the bear spray on my belt, but I never uncapped it. There was no movement, no sound of large animals moving through brush, just that strange, heavy quiet. When the normal forest sounds gradually returned, they came back in layers. First, the river's volume seemed to normalize, then bird calls resumed one by one, until finally the squirrels started up again, as if nothing had happened. I made myself complete the planned route, taking photos and GPS readings as intended, but I kept stopping to listen, trying to catch that unnatural silence again. It never returned. Back at the cabin that evening, I added this entry to my log. September 10th, 2008, 1600 hours. Notable atmospheric anomaly. Observed during morning survey. Approximately 10:30 hours, all ambient sound significantly decreased for 6+ minutes. No visible cause, no wind changes, temperature steady at 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Clear skies. Possible pressure system effect? Follow up with base meteorologist. I tried to be clinical about it in my notes, to frame it in scientific terms. That's what you're trained to do. Document objectively, avoid speculation. But sitting there in the cabin that night, listening to the normal evening sounds through the walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd experienced something I couldn't quite explain. The next few days, I tried to maintain my normal routine, but I found myself paying closer attention to details I might have overlooked before. It was during my standard perimeter check of cabin AK8 that I first noticed the impressions. They were in a patch of thick moss, about 40 feet from the cabin's back door. At first glance, they looked like someone had pressed their boot heel into the soft ground, but something wasn't right about them. I pulled out my field notebook and took measurements. Each depression was roughly 16 inches long and 8 inches wide at the broadest point. The depth varied between 2 and 3 inches, suggesting considerable weight. Human boots, even the heavy-duty winter ones we use up here, don't leave marks like that. I photographed them with my digital camera, placing my own size 11 boot print nearby for scale. The size difference was striking. I radioed base camp to check if any other personnel were scheduled to be in the area. Marie, our coordinator, confirmed what I already knew. I was the only one assigned to this sector until the end of the month. No hunting permits had been issued for this zone yet, and the research teams weren't due until spring. That night, around 2200 hours, I heard it for the first time. Knocking sounds coming from the timber stand northeast of the cabin. 2 distinct strikes, then silence, then 3 more, spaced about 10 seconds apart. The sound carried, clearly through the still air, like someone hitting a hollow tree with a baseball bat. I grabbed my flashlight and stood in the doorway, listening. The knocks came again, this time from a different direction, maybe 200 yards to the northwest. I swept the tree line with my light, but saw nothing except the reflective eyes of a great horned owl perched in a spruce. My first thought was other hikers, maybe lost or playing some kind of game. But that didn't make sense. The nearest trail, access, was 18 miles away, and no vehicles had passed through according to my motion-triggered cameras at the access road. I documented everything in my log. September 13th, 2008, 22:15 hours. Audible wood-knocking sounds from any and NW positions. Duration, approximately 15 minutes. No visual confirmation of source. Large ground impressions discovered earlier. Photos attached. No scheduled personnel. In area. Will increase camera coverage tomorrow. The knocking continued intermittently for another 15 minutes before stopping completely. I stayed up until midnight, waiting to see if it would resume, but heard nothing except the normal night sounds of the forest. I'm not prone to jumping at shadows or inventing explanations for every strange sound in the woods, but those prints bothered me. They were too large, too clearly defined to be dismissed as weather damage or animal beds. And those knocks, they had a deliberate quality to them, a rhythm that felt almost like communication. The knocking continued, intermittently through the night. I tried to convince myself it was just branches in the wind, but there wasn't enough breeze to justify that explanation. Around 3:15 in the morning, my trail camera's motion sensor triggered. I had positioned it to watch the storage shed where we keep extra supplies and equipment. When I checked the footage the next morning, frame 173 made my coffee go cold in my hand. The image quality wasn't great. These cameras aren't designed for nighttime photography, but there was something there that shouldn't have been. An upright shape, probably 7 or 8 feet tall, stood near the corner of the shed. The figure was blurred, like it had been moving when the shot was taken, but the basic outline was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, no visible neck, and what appeared to be very long arms. I stared at that frame for a long time, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was just shadows playing tricks, or perhaps the infrared flash had created some kind of visual artifact. The logical part of my brain worked overtime to explain it away. After all, I'd seen plenty of odd things in trail cam footage before. Birds caught mid-flight that looked like UFOs, deer that appeared to be standing on 2 legs, that sort of thing. But something about this image was different. The proportions were wrong for any animal I knew, and the way it seemed to be oriented toward the camera lens made the hair on my neck stand up. I decided to check the camera itself, thinking maybe a technical malfunction could explain the strange image. As I approached the trail cam, I noticed immediately that something was off. The mounting bracket was slightly twisted, about 15 degrees off from where I'd originally positioned it. The camera itself was intact, but the angle had definitely changed. Getting closer, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. On the housing of the camera, there was a smudge. Not dirt or tree sap, but what looked like a deliberate mark, as if something had reached out and touched the lens. The mark was about 3 inches wide and had a distinct pattern that reminded me of a whorl or fingerprint, but much larger than any human finger could make. I took detailed photos of both the camera position and the mark, making sure to include multiple angles and reference points. In my field journal, I wrote down the exact time and date, along with weather conditions and any other relevant details I could think of. Years of scientific training kicked in. Document everything, assume nothing. But as I stood there in the crisp morning air, looking between the camera and the shed, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made that mark hadn't touched the camera by accident. It felt deliberate, almost like a message. The way it seemed to be deliberately positioned in the frame bothered me. I've worked with trail cameras for years. Animals typically trigger them by passing through, resulting in partial captures or blur. This figure was centered, almost as if. I shook my head and decided to do a thorough inventory of the storage shed. The autumn morning was crisp, my breath visible in small clouds as I unlocked the heavy padlock. Everything seemed normal at first glance. The usual assortment of tools, spare parts and supplies that we keep on hand for maintaining the remote cabins. But something felt off. I keep meticulous records. It's part of why I was hired for this position. And I'm particular about how things are organized. The hammer and pry bar were usually stored on the left side of the workbench, but now they sat on the right, stacked, in a crude pile. A kerosene lantern that I distinctly remembered placing on the bottom shelf now sat on the middle one. "You're being paranoid, Daniel," I muttered to myself, running through possible explanations. Maybe I'd been more tired than usual during my last supply check. Or perhaps I'd moved things around absent-mindedly while looking for something else. It wouldn't be the first time fatigue had made me sloppy. I pulled out my notebook and began documenting the discrepancies anyway. Even if it turned out to be nothing, maintaining accurate records was crucial out here. Under the date, October 8th, 2008, I wrote, "Storage shed inventory anomalies." That last detail caught my attention as I wrote it. I hadn't consciously registered it before, but the heavy tarp we used to protect the spare lumber was definitely different. I always folded the corners neatly to prevent water from pooling, but now they were loose, as if someone had lifted the tarp and replaced it hastily. My hand hesitated over the notebook. Should I add a note about the trail cam image? The professional part of me wanted to document everything, but another part worried about looking foolish if someone read this later. In the end, I compromised. Note: trail camera number 3 captured unusual movement near shed at 03:15 hours. Image quality poor, possible equipment malfunction or wildlife. Will monitor. I closed the notebook and secured the shed, double-checking the padlock. The morning sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows through the spruce trees. Everything looked normal in the daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place had changed. The familiar sounds of the forest, ravens calling, the distant rush of the river, suddenly seemed like they were masking something else, something I couldn't quite identify. I was reviewing the footage from Trail Camera 5 when my coffee mug nearly slipped from my hands. The timestamp read 04:27, just before dawn on October 9th, 2008. Unlike the previous blurry capture, these images were devastatingly clear. The infrared sensor had triggered in sequence, capturing 6 frames over 12 seconds. In the first image, nothing seemed amiss. Just the familiar outline of the storage shed against the pre-dawn darkness. But in the second frame, something massive moved into view. My hands trembled as I clicked through to the third image. There it stood, a silhouette that defied explanation. The figure was impossibly broad-shouldered, its height difficult to gauge but clearly towering over the shed's doorframe, which I knew stood 7 feet high. What struck me most was its deliberate posture. Not the random wandering of a bear or other wildlife, but purposeful movement. Frame 4 showed it reaching for the door handle. The motion was unmistakably intentional, Fingers. Yes, fingers. Clearly visible as they wrapped around the metal latch. My throat went dry as I realized this matched perfectly with the displaced tools I'd found inside. The fifth frame captured the moment the door began to give way. The figure's massive arm flexed, and I could see the metal hinges straining. But it was the final frame that made my blood run cold, a blur of movement as the camera itself was struck, followed by nothing but black. Whatever this thing was, it had noticed the camera and deliberately disabled it. With shaking hands, I documented the timestamp and sequence in my log, trying to maintain my usual professional tone, despite the fear coursing through me. I knew I needed to retrieve the camera. Protocol demanded it. Any damaged equipment had to be documented and recovered. But the thought of walking to that spot, where just hours ago this creature had stood, made my chest tight. I waited until full daylight before making my way to Camera 5's location. The morning was eerily still. No wind in the trees, no bird calls. Just the crunch of my boots on the frosted ground and my own measured breathing as I tried to stay calm. The camera hung askew on its mounting strap, the sturdy metal housing dented as if struck by tremendous force. These units were designed to withstand bear encounters, but this damage suggested something far stronger. I carefully detached it and examined the mounting point on the tree. Deep gouges marked the bark where the camera had been struck, and below it, pressed into the thin layer of frost, was a single massive footprint. I stared at that impression for a long moment, my mind struggling to process its size and shape. It was clearly a foot, 5 distinct toes visible in the impression, but scaled up to impossible proportions. I pulled out my notebook and began sketching it with trembling hands, adding careful measurements and notes about depth and stride pattern. That evening, as darkness settled over the cabin, an unfamiliar scent began seeping through the weathered logs. At first, it was subtle, just a hint of something wild and organic. But as the night deepened, the odor grew more pronounced. It reminded me of wet fur after a rainstorm, mixed with a heavy musk that made my nose wrinkle. This wasn't the usual forest smell I'd grown accustomed to over my weeks here. This was something primordial and distinctly animal. I double-checked all the windows and doors, making sure everything was securely latched. The temperature outside had dropped to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, according to my thermometer, and a light frost was already forming on the glass. But despite the cold, that organic, musky smell continued to intensify. At 9:45 p.m., I felt the first prickle of unease crawl up my spine. You know that sensation when you're absolutely certain you're being watched? The way the hairs on your arms and neck stand up and your skin feels electrically charged? That's exactly what I experienced. I stood perfectly still in the center of the cabin, straining my ears for any sound of movement outside. Nothing. No footsteps in the frost. No branches creaking under weight. Just that oppressive silence I'd noticed earlier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The feeling of being observed didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. I found myself avoiding the windows, staying away from the walls, as if proximity to the outside would somehow make me more vulnerable. The rational part of my mind knew this was ridiculous. I was inside a solid structure with locked doors, but that primal instinct, the one telling me to stay small and quiet, was screaming. At 10:15 p.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to report this, to have some human contact, even if it made me sound paranoid. I picked up the radio, my hands trembling slightly as I adjusted the frequency. Base camp, this is Harker at AK-8, over. I tried to keep my voice steady, professional, but I could hear the strain in it. After a moment of static, the supervisor's calm voice came through. Go ahead, AK-8. I need to report some unusual activity. I paused, struggling to frame this without sounding unhinged. Had some equipment damage today. Trail camera 5 was destroyed. Found large tracks nearby. And now there's this smell. What kind of smell, Harker? Strong animal musk. Like wet. Fur, but different. And I've got this feeling. I stopped, realizing how it would sound. What feeling? The supervisor's tone remained neutral, but I could sense the subtle shift in their attention. Like something's watching the cabin. I know how that sounds, but after those camera images, my voice trailed off as the musty odor seemed to surge, stronger, making me gag slightly. There was a long pause before base camp responded. Document everything. Weather's turning bad tomorrow. We'll try to get someone out there when it clears. Just stay inside for now. The radio fell silent, leaving me alone with that penetrating stare I couldn't see, and the overwhelming scent of something large and wild just beyond the cabin walls, like wet fur and musk, strong, animal, but different from bear or moose. And there's been some strange behavior around the cabin that... A heavy thump against the outer wall cut me off, mid-sentence. The impact was solid enough to make the windows rattle. Harker, what was that? The supervisor's voice crackled through the radio. Stand by, I whispered, my heart hammering. I set the radio down carefully and reached for my flashlight. Another thump resonated from the opposite wall, as if something massive was circling the cabin. Then came the knocking. It wasn't random or accidental. 3 distinct knocks in succession, followed by 2 more. They emanated from the tree line about 30 yards from the cabin's front door. The sound was too deliberate to be branches in the wind, too rhythmic to be natural. Base camp. I spoke into the radio again, keeping my voice low. I'm hearing impacts against the cabin walls and what sounds like structured knocking from the forest. Could be ice falling from trees, the supervisor suggested. We've had reports of early freeze-thaw cycles up there. I wanted to believe that explanation. I wrote it down in my journal, adding it to my growing list of rational possibilities. Ice falls, branch impacts, possible moose rub. But even as I documented these explanations, my hand was shaking, making the writing uneven. The knocking came again, this time from a different section of the tree line. Same pattern, 3 hits, pause, 2 hits. I grabbed my high-powered flashlight and approached the window, sweeping the beam across the frost-covered ground and into the darkness between the trees. Nothing moved in the light's path. No reflective eyes, no shifting shadows. But the moment my flashlight beam cut through the darkness, the knocking stopped. I documented this in my journal, trying to maintain objectivity. 22:27. Knocking ceases when illuminated. No visible source. Temperature, 32 degrees. Wind, minimal. Below this entry, I added a personal note I couldn't keep to myself. These are not random occurrences. There's intelligence behind these actions. The camera damage, the smell, the knocking. It's all connected. Base camp to AK-8, the radio crackled. Do you want us to send someone up there? I stared at the radio, torn between my need for backup and my professional pride. The knocking had resumed, now moving systematically around the tree line, as if testing my reactions. Each series of impacts was identical in rhythm and force, ruling out any natural explanation I could think of. Harker, do you copy? I picked up the radio, my mouth dry. I copy, base camp. And yes, I think that might be wise. Something's not right up here. The admission cost me, but as another round of knocks echoed through the darkness, I knew I couldn't face this alone anymore. Whatever was out there was getting bolder, more deliberate in its actions, and the rational explanations in my journal were starting to feel like desperate attempts to deny the obvious. The next few days blurred together in a haze of mounting tension. Each morning, I'd force myself to maintain my routine, checking trail cameras, logging maintenance tasks, radioing updates to base camp, but something had fundamentally shifted in these woods. During my scheduled hiking rounds on Wednesday, I first noticed the footsteps. They kept pace with me through the dense brush about 40 yards to my left, just far enough that the vegetation obscured any clear view. I stopped. The steps stopped. I moved. They moved. The precision of it sent ice through my veins. In my journal that evening, I wrote, Day 3 of parallel tracking. Subject maintains consistent distance, approximately 40 yards. Sound suggests bipedal movement, heavy but controlled. Cannot confirm visual. Thursday's hike to check the Western Trail cameras produced the same effect, only this time from my right flank. The steps were more pronounced on the rocky terrain, and I could distinguish a pattern, a deliberate, measured gait that no four-legged animal would make. I found myself constantly turning my head, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was keeping pace with me. By Friday, I was spending more time looking over my shoulder than forward. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against my back during every outdoor task. Even simple maintenance jobs like checking the generator became exercises in hypervigilance. That night, I sat at the cabin's small desk, staring at the satellite phone. My fingers hovered over the keypad as I debated calling in for an early extraction. The rational part of my brain listed reasons to stay. I had 2 more weeks of contracted work. The weather was holding, and leaving early could damage my professional reputation. Plus, how would I explain it? "Sorry, something's following me in the woods," sounded pathetic, even in my head. But another voice, one rooted in deeper instincts, screamed that staying was a mistake. Each day brought new signs that I wasn't alone. Up here, and whatever was watching me was growing bolder. The parallel tracking during my hikes felt like testing behavior, as if something was measuring my reactions, learning my patterns. I documented everything meticulously, trying to maintain scientific detachment. Friday 2000 hours. Continuing pressure from unidentified presence. Parallel movement suggests intelligence rather than random animal behavior. No direct confrontation, but persistent surveillance indicated. Looking back at my journal entries, I could see how my handwriting had changed, starting neat and methodical, now showing subtle signs of stress in pressed too hard letters and uneven lines. Even my attempt at professional distance couldn't hide the growing strain. The satellite phone sat silent on the desk. I still had a job to do, responsibilities to fulfill. But for the first time in my career, I was seriously questioning whether professional duty was worth the risk of staying in these mountains. I couldn't take it anymore. After another sleepless night filled with heavy footsteps circling the cabin, I made my decision at first light. My hands shook as I wrote in my journal. October 15th, 0600 hours. Conditions deteriorating. Safety concerns necessitate immediate evacuation. Will radio base camp for extraction. The response from base wasn't what I'd hoped for. Earliest pickup available in 48 hours due to weather system moving in, the operator informed me. My scheduled departure was only 4 days away, but those extra 2 days felt like an eternity. I started packing immediately, my normally methodical inventory process abandoned in favor of speed. Essential gear first. Satellite phone, GPS unit, emergency supplies. The rest could stay. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely write my final log entry. Departing AK-8 cabin at 0700 hours. Following established. Trail to secondary extraction point at Mirror Lake. Weather clear, temperature 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The morning sun barely penetrated the dense canopy as I shouldered my pack and locked the cabin door. I'd barely made it 50 yards when I heard it. That familiar heavy gait matching my pace through the trees to my right. My throat went dry. The sound stayed with me as I moved along the ridge trail, maintaining that same maddening distance of about 40 yards. Every time I stopped to check my bearings or take a drink, the footsteps would cease. The moment I resumed walking, they would start again. Not random animal movements. This was deliberate pacing, a calculated parallel track that spoke of intelligence and purpose. By midday, I'd covered roughly 6 miles. The tracking sounds had shifted to the ridgeline above me, the impacts heavier on the rocky terrain. Each echoing footfall sent a jolt through my spine. My journal entries during brief rests became increasingly erratic. Still following, always following, can hear it. Moving through rocks above, why won't it just show itself? The afternoon brought a heavy mist that reduced visibility to less than 30 feet. The footsteps grew closer in the fog, perhaps 30 yards now instead of 40. I abandoned any pretense of regular breaks and pushed on through exhaustion, my pace bordering on reckless. My final journal entry of the day, scrawled during a brief stop to check coordinates, betrays how far my professional demeanor had crumbled. Can't shake it. Getting closer. Should never have stayed after first camera. Incident. Something watching, waiting. God help me if fog gets worse before I reach extraction point. The tracking sounds stayed with me until dusk, fading only when I caught sight of the emergency shelter near Mirror Lake, where I'd spend the night. Even then, I could feel eyes on me from the darkening tree line. I'd covered nearly 15 miles in my panic-fueled march, but those watching footsteps had matched me step for step, never tiring, never falling behind. I later learned that Ranger Laura Keene and Trooper Alan Reeves conducted the initial inspection of cabin AK-8 2 days after my departure. Their official report, which I obtained through a Freedom of Information request, painted a predictable picture. Cabin inspection reveals signs consistent with bear activity, Trooper Reeves wrote in his assessment. Storage shed shows damage to exterior latch mechanism. Interior contents disturbed. Multiple items scattered across floor suggesting animal foraging behavior. But it was their private conversation, recorded inadvertently on Ranger Keene's body camera and included in my FOIA materials, that told a different story. The audio captured them examining the twisted metal of the shed's latch mechanism. This isn't right. Keene's voice came through clearly on the recording. I've seen plenty of bear damage, Alan. They tear things apart, use brute force. This latch, it's been manipulated, almost like someone used tools to wrench it sideways. Keep that observation unofficial, Reeves responded, his tone cautious. The department wants this logged as standard wildlife damage, easier for everyone. The recording continued as they moved through the cabin's interior. Look at how these supplies are stacked, Keene noted. Bears scatter things, make a mess. This is organized, deliberate. Could be the technician himself, Reeves suggested, though his voice carried doubt. Stress does strange things to people alone out here. Maybe, Keene replied. But that doesn't explain the latch. That took significant mechanical force, applied with precision, not random animal damage. Their footsteps creaked across the cabin floor as they continued their inspection. What about these prints outside? Keene asked. They're mostly degraded now, but the size and depth, I've never seen anything quite like them. We're noting them as unidentified large mammal tracks in the report, Reeves said firmly. Nothing more specific than that. The recording captured their final exchange before they secured the cabin. Laura, Reeves said quietly, whatever did this, let's keep our theories to ourselves. Some things are better left in these mountains. Agreed, Keene responded. Official report stays simple. Bear damage, case closed. The rest of their report stuck to that narrative. Standard wildlife interaction requiring no further investigation. But that private conversation about the twisted latch haunts me. They saw what I saw, felt what I felt. They just couldn't, or wouldn't, officially acknowledge it. I received the trail cam photos back from the ranger station 3 weeks after my hasty departure from cabin Alaska 8. Sarah Chen, one of the senior wildlife technicians, had called me personally rather than sending an official email. Her voice carried that careful neutrality we all use when discussing something we can't quite explain. Daniel, I've reviewed the images you recovered, she said, pausing deliberately. We're having trouble reaching a consensus on classification. Would you be willing to come in and discuss what you observed firsthand? I declined. The thought of examining those photos, of reliving those final days at the cabin, made my hands shake. But Sarah shared the internal debate anyway. The technical staff had split into 2 camps. Those who insisted the figures were just trespassers caught in poor lighting conditions, and those who couldn't reconcile the proportions and movements with any known human profiles. The height estimates are problematic, Sarah admitted, based on the reference points in frame, the shed door, the equipment crates. We're looking at something well over 7 feet tall, and the shoulder width." She trailed off. The images circulated quietly through the department. I heard through former colleagues that copies had made their way to the State Wildlife Office and even a university anthropology department. No one would go on record with definitive statements. The photos remained in a kind of administrative limbo, neither officially explained nor officially unexplainable. Mark Townsend, one of our senior photographers, spent 3 days analysing the clearest frame, the one showing the figure at the shed door. He focused on the way the subject's mass displaced in movement, the muscle definition visible despite the blur. "Look at the deltoid and trapezius development," he told me over the phone. "That's not a person in a suit. The biomechanics are all wrong. And see how the head sits directly on the shoulders. No distinct neck. I've photographed every large mammal in Alaska, and this doesn't match any known profile." But his analysis never made it into any official report. The photos were filed away with minimal notation. Possible human interference and image quality insufficient for species identification. I received a copy of the classification paperwork a month later. Most of the technical details had been redacted, leaving only vague references to inconclusive evidence and further study required. The trail cam itself was logged into storage rather than returned to me, listed simply as equipment requiring maintenance. Sarah called one final time, her voice lower than usual. "Daniel, some of us, we've seen things too. Up in the remote, stations. Things that don't fit the textbooks. We keep our notes private, but we know." She paused. "Those photos you took, they're not the first. They probably won't be the last. Just be careful about who you talk to about this." The photos remain unclassified to this day, buried in some filing cabinet, but sometimes, late at night, I still see that massive silhouette burned into my memory. Too tall, too broad, too wrong to be human, yet too deliberate in its movements to be anything else we know. I never went back to fieldwork after that autumn, in 2008. The department offered me other positions: data analysis, equipment maintenance, even a desk job coordinating seasonal staff. But something fundamental had shifted in me during those nights at Cabin Alaska 8. The wilderness no longer felt like a realm I had any right to inhabit. When reporters or researchers would reach out for interviews in the years that followed, I kept my responses measured and brief. Most seemed disappointed, expecting tales of terror or near-death encounters. But that wasn't what haunted me. What I experienced wasn't a hunt. It was an examination. I felt like I was being studied, I explained to Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a behavioral ecologist who interviewed me in 2013. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just tracking me or trying to scare me away. It was learning about me, testing boundaries, observing responses. I described how tools would be arranged in new configurations, how my movements around the cabin were mirrored and analysed. The creature, or creatures, seemed to be building a systematic understanding of human behaviour through me. The intelligence behind it, I told her. That's what truly unsettled me. Not the size or strength displayed in those photos, but the deliberate nature of every interaction, the way it would test the shed lock, examine our equipment, even attempt to manipulate our tools. There was purpose there. Method. Some nights I still wake up remembering that pervasive sense of being watched, not with malice, but with an almost clinical detachment, like a biologist observing a new species in their habitat. The role reversal left me deeply shaken. We humans are so accustomed to being the observers, the cataloguers, the ones who study and classify. To suddenly find yourself on the other side of that equation. I crossed a line I didn't even know existed, I explained during my last interview in 2016. We think we understand our place in these remote spaces, that we've mapped and measured every corner of wilderness. But there are layers of existence out there that operate beyond our comprehension. Things that watch and wait and know far more about us than we do about them. The experience changed how I view humanity's relationship with wild places. We're not the dominant force we imagine ourselves to be. We're just one species among many, and perhaps not even the most intelligent one out there. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. Some knowledge fundamentally alters how you move through the world. I still have my field journals from that time, filled with my increasingly uncertain observations, but I keep them locked away now. Not out of fear, but out of respect for boundaries I now know exist. Boundaries between the world we think we understand, and something far older and wiser watching from the shadows. The official reports tell one story: bears breaking into cabin Alaska 8, drawn by stored supplies or lingering food scents. Ranger Laura Keene's assessment points to ursine activity consistent with late-season foraging patterns. Her photographs document the twisted metal latch, the scattered equipment, the deep gouges in the shed door. All explainable through conventional wildlife behavior. But my journals tell a different narrative. Page after page details purposeful interactions, tools arranged in crude attempts at stacking, equipment examined and carefully replaced, movements that suggested learning rather than random destruction, the knocking patterns that seemed to mimic our own maintenance signals, that pervasive sense of being observed and analysed. Then there are the photographs themselves. Unlike my written accounts or the ranger's interpretations, they remain unaltered. Raw data captured in the pre-dawn hours. The broad-shouldered silhouette forcing the shed door. The massive upright form moving with deliberate purpose. Images that resist easy classification, hovering in that uncomfortable space between the known and the unknown. I've come to believe that some of our remote shelters serve as observation posts, not just for humans studying wildlife, but for something else studying us. Those cabins sit at the intersection between worlds, recording encounters we may not be prepared to fully comprehend. The evidence exists in official files, personal journals, and unedited photographs. What we choose to make of it depends largely on how much we're willing to question our assumptions about our place in the wilderness. Thank you for being part of this moment. I'll be here tomorrow, ready to share another story that comforts the soul.